We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Amud Aleph in Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 70a. On the previous summit, the Gemara said that if a seller sells a field to a buyer, but the seller says that I'm retaining the trees for myself, so the understanding is that he's really retaining only the significant trees for himself. And the question is, what's considered to be a significant tree? Rav said on the previous summit it's considered to be significant if you have to use a rope in order to climb the tree. The Rashbam explained we're talking there about palm trees. And the Gemara now continues, V'dayone gola amri. Now the judges of the exile, they say, and the Rashbam says Dayone gola refers to Shmuel v'Karna. It refers to Shmuel and Karna. We find that B'Perek Hamid Sanhedrin. We find that in the first Perek of Sanhedrin. In any case, the judges of the exile, they say what's considered a significant tree and what's not considered a significant tree. Kol sha'ol kovsho, if the yoke of the animal as they're plowing, if it bends the tree, so lo havashir, that's not considered considered something the seller retains for himself because it's not a significant tree. It's able to be bent by the yoke. Kol she'ein ha'ol kovsho, but if it's a tree that cannot be bent by the yoke, havashir, so that remains to the seller, that's considered to be significant. And the Rashbam explains Kol sha'ol kovsho chorshin hayu bebakar saviv ha'ilanos, they would plow with cattle around the trees. V'im ha'ol kofef esa'ilan, if the yoke is able to bend the tree, v'over hashor ledarko, the ox is able to just continue on his way, v'ein ha'ilan ma'akev hashor, and the tree does not hold back the ox, lo chashav, that's not a significant tree. Umiu, and nevertheless, im ein ilanos gedolim basada, the Rashbam does point out if there are no big trees in the field, ela elu, except for these ones, have a shiur. So then these obviously are the ones that the seller is retaining for himself. Kedamran gabe dikli, we said the same thing when it comes to the palm trees. In any case, this is the explanation of the Dayane Gola in order to determine what is a significant tree. But the Gemara notes velo pligi, but really Rav and the Dayane Gola are not actually arguing, because habedikle habilani, one is talking about palm trees. So the palm trees, as we said, you have to climb. It's very hard to climb. It's very high up, and so those you use ropes. If you have to use a rope to climb up, that's significant. By other trees, that's when we decide based on whether the yoke is able to bend the tree or not. And the Rashbam explains, Habedikli mil say the Rav. Rav was talking about palm trees, and Habi ilani, when we talk about whether the yoke can bend the tree, that's by other trees. Sha'ol kovsho, again, that the yoke bends it. The shiur da'aliyas chevel lo shayich bu, because it doesn't make sense to talk about having to use a rope to climb a tree by other kinds of trees. Develo chevel olin b'chol sharilonos, because other kinds of trees, you can always climb those trees without a rope. Al yadei anafim hamispatzlim l'chol tzad, because there are branches all over the place. The whole idea is that a palm tree, the branches are only at the very top, and it's just a trunk all the way up, very high up. Also, when it comes to bending the yoke, bending the tree, that also is not relevant to palm trees. Even in a situation where it bends it, it's still considered to be a significant tree if you have to use a rope in order to climb up. And the Gemara continues, Rav Acha bar Huna asks Rav Sheshes the following question, Chutz me chariv ploni. Let's say the person sells a field, and he says, with the exception of this particular carob tree, or Chutz mi sadan ploni, or says, with the exception of this particular developed sycamore tree. So mahu, what would be the halach in that situation? Oso charav hu delokani, would it only be that particular carob tree that the buyer does not acquire? That's the only one that the seller retains for himself. Hashar charuvim kani, but in this case, the rest of the carob trees the buyer would get. Odilmor, maybe shar charuvin nami lokani, maybe the other charuvin, the other carob trees as well, he won't be able to acquire. Amarle said back to him, lokani, he's not going to acquire any of the carob trees. And the Rashbam explains, Chutz me charav hamurkov, again, this is talking about the grafted carob tree, the one that's more developed. Ploni, the specific one, Chutz mi sadan hashikma ploni, or besides for this particular sycamore tree. V'hayu baharbe charuvim v'sadan. Now there's a lot of carob in sycamore trees. So what's the halacha? Di'im have a shasik. The point of the question over here is, had the person not said anything at all, lo hayu mechurn b'chlal sada. The halacha is these kind of trees never get sold along with the field. The seller always retains them. But now that he's having one particular one, he's saying he's keeping for himself. So now we can say that he actually sold him the rest of the carob trees. Maybe that's the whole point, is he's selling him more than usual. Maybe maybe the fact that he said he wants to keep one for himself, that doesn't lessen the strength of the seller. nami lo kani halokech. The buyer doesn't get any of the carob trees. The b'shvil sheyifa hamocher's koach shalosh apirish beferish and any mocher lochahu charav. Just because the seller said something he didn't have to and said, I'm not selling you this carob tree, ein lanu legareya kocho b'shar. We're not going to lessen the strength of the seller with the rest of the trees. But if maybe we can do something with this extra phrase, like we've seen earlier, that if there's an extra phrase thrown in, it means to include something else. Could go in, for example, derech. Maybe what he means to say is he wants a path to the tree. Matfinan le. So then we're going to add that. Maybe that's what's going on over here. So that essentially is the question of the Gemara. And the Gemara continues. Eisvei, we have a question on this from the following brisa. Chutz me chorav ploni, chutz me sad and ploni. The brisa says, if he says, I'm selling you a field except for this carob tree, except for this sycamore tree, lo kana, he does not acquire. And the Gemara says, my lav is it not? Also chorav hu de lo kana. The brisa means he doesn't acquire that particular carob tree. Hashar charuvin kana, but the brisa is saying that the rest of the carob trees, the buyer actually does acquire. Amar le said back to him, lo, no, that's not what the brisa means. Afilu shar charuvin nami lo kana. Even the other carob trees, the buyer does not acquire them. And the Gemara continues, Teda, you should know this is true. De'ilu amarle, because if a seller would say to a buyer, Sadi mechur alach, my field is being sold to you, chutz misada plonis, except for this field that's adjacent, I'm not selling that one. Hahihu delo kani, ha'achranaisa kani, do you think that he's not going to get that adjacent field, but he'll get the other fields? Of course not. He's not going to get any other fields, he's only getting the field that's actually being sold. Ela lo kana, rather you say, of course he doesn't acquire anything else. Hachanami lo kana, so to over here, he's not going to acquire the other carob trees. And the Gemara continues, Vika de'amri, there are those that say a slightly different version of the above Gemara. Boi minei Rav Acha bar Huna me Rav Sheshes, Rav Acha bar Huna asked Rav Sheshes the following question, Chutz me chatzi chorav ploni. Let's say the seller says to the buyer, I'm selling you the field except for half of this particular carob tree. Or Chutz me chatzi sadan ploni, or except for half of this particular sycamore tree. Mahu, what would be the halacha? Shar charuv and vade lo kani. Now the other carob trees, for sure the buyer does not acquire. You don't generally acquire the carob trees together with the field. Hamasha shai, but maybe that which the seller retained in the particular charav, meaning to say, the seller said that he's keeping for himself half of the charav, the other half, kani, so maybe that the buyer would get. Odilmar, maybe, nami lo kani, even what was left off in that particular carob tree, maybe the buyer doesn't get that either. Amarle said to him, lo kani, he doesn't get it. The buyer doesn't get any of the carob tree, even though the way the seller phrased it was, I'm going to retain half of the carob tree, the seller actually takes the whole thing. And the Gemara continues, Eisvei, we have a question from the following brisa. Chutz mechatzi charav ploni. It says this is exactly the case. The seller says to the buyer, I'm selling you the field except for half of this particular carob tree. Chutz mechatzi sadan ploni. I'm selling you the field except for half of this particular sycamore tree. Shar charuvin lo kana. It says in the brisa he doesn't get the other carob trees. My lav, doesn't it mean to say shar charuvin hu de lo kana? He doesn't get the other carob trees. Hamasha shayir boso charav kana. But whatever was remaining in that particular carob tree, the buyer does in fact get. Amarle said to him, lo, no, afilu masha shayir boso charav nami lo kana. Even what was remaining in the other carob tree, he doesn't get that either. The seller retains it all. Teida, you should know, di'ilu amarle, because if the seller would say to the buyer, Sadi mechuralach, my field is sold to you, chutz mechatzi sada ploni, except for half of this particular field that's adjacent, hahuhu de lo kana ha'idach kana, you think he's not going to get that half, but the buyer will get the other half of the adjacent field? Of course not. He's only getting the field that's sold to him. Ela lo kani, rather, of course he doesn't acquire. Hachanami, here too by the carob, lo kani, he's not going to acquire that half. And the Gemara continues, Bo minei Rav Amram me Rav Chisda. Rav Amram asked Rav Chisda the following question: if somebody deposits something by his friend with a document, in other words, the owner of the item now has a document in his possession that says that I gave you this particular item, I want to collect it back. V'yomar lo, and then he says to him, when the owner comes with a document and says, give me my item, the person who's watching over the item says, Hechzartum lach, I actually already returned it to you. So what would be the halach in that case? Mi amrin on migo, do we say over there he has a migo? Di bayamar nensu, because if he wanted, he could have said that there was an onus, there was an accident. The shomer is not responsible for accidents, and mehemin, he would have been believed. So hashtanami mehemin. So now also when he says I returned it, he's believed, even though the owner is presenting a shtar. O dilmor, maybe Omar le, he can say to him, the owner can say to the shomer, shtar chabiyadi, my boy, what is your shtar doing in my possession? If you really returned the item, you should have retrieved the shtar. You should be the one with the shtar. I shouldn't have the shtar. The shtar proves that the item is still in your possession. Amar le said to him, Mehemin, the shomer is believed in this case, and he's believed to say that he returned it, again, because he has a migo, he could have said there was an onus. But the Gemara says, but why can't the owner say to the shomer, he should say to the nifkad, the person who's watching the deposit, what is your star doing in my possession? That is evidence that you didn't return it. Amar le said to him, but according to your reasoning, if the nifkad would have claimed there was an accident, can the owner respond, what's your star doing in my possession? That's not a good response in a situation where he says onus, and so therefore it's not a good response either in a situation where he says that he returned it. Amar le, he said to him, and the Rashbam explains, Boy minei Rav Amram asked the following question, Mishum de dayone gola nakat lahacha, since we mentioned the judges of the exile, that's why we bring this case over here. And the Rashbam continues, V'lataymech, according to your reasoning, ilu amar le nensu, if you would say nensu, could the other person respond, why do I have a star? Hilkach lo motzi limitan mafkid shtarcha biyadi, my boy, therefore this claim of the mafkid, what is your star doing in my possession? That is not a good claim. It's not similar to a lamali l'shakar, to a migo b'makam edim, because maybe you'll say over here he's claiming that I already returned it, but it's going against edim because there are edim signed on the star. It's not like that. Because it could happen. Sometimes a nifkad might return the object and he'll say, I want the star back, and the person will say, the owner will say, well, I lost the star, I don't have the star anymore, and there's nothing the nifkad could do about it. And the nifkad won't even care about the fact that he doesn't get back the star, because he knows he can always exempt himself by saying there was an accident. And so therefore it's not considered a migo, it's not considered a lamali l'shakir b'makam edim. And the Rashbam points out, let's say you have a loan, not a deposit, but a loan with a star, so there lo matzi toin lova parati, there the borrower can't claim I paid back if the malva is still holding the star. My boy, because the malva can always say back, what do I have your star in my possession for? And by a lova, by a borrower, there is no migo. Because even if a borrower would say onus, that wouldn't help. A borrower still has to pay back to milva, because the whole point of a loan is that it's meant to be spent, you're paying back other money essentially, and so therefore where there's no migo, so there wouldn't be any such claim there. If the malva has the star, he certainly could collect, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Amud Beis.